As Gigi said, my name is James Kirkland. I'm a program officer at the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. My primary responsibility is grants administration. So I do the day-to-day work of the grants admin and work with Gigi on evaluation, program development, and other aspects of our programming. So today's workshop is going to be a sort of high-level overview of how to apply for a grant. So we're going to cover some really kind of basic things. What are the public humanities? Some information about where to find our grant guidelines, the difference between action and incubation grants, because that's a very important question that you'll need to decide as you are applying, and going over the application itself, just sort of a high level overview so you can have an idea of what to expect. So you can kind of prepare in advance. Some important dates, and at the very end, we'll have a space for Q&A. We'll also be stopping intermittently through questions. And as Gigi said, if you have questions throughout, please sort of raise your hands or put your questions in the chat. Now, sort of start off with, curious, how many people, is this your first time or your first time in a long time applying for an NJCH grant? So please either put that in the chat or raise your hand. Just kind of get curious. It looks like we have quite a few new people here. Okay, so one of the fundamental questions, fundamental pieces is public humanities. So broadly, the humanities explore human histories, values, cultures, and beliefs. We could think of humanities in two ways, really. Humanities as subjects. So these would be history, literature, rhetoric, jurisprudence. But we also consider humanities as a practice, which would be critical thinking, inquiry, dialogue, exploring and cross-difference. So this is really fundamental to the projects we fund. We fund humanities projects, and actually specifically public humanities projects. So we're looking for projects that make the insights of the humanities accessible to broad public audiences. So we don't really fund projects that are really for a sort of limited scholarly audience. We are looking to make the humanities accessible to a broader public. Now, there's one important consideration, which is, and this comes up a lot, is arts versus the humanities. Now, there are projects that are sort of in a gray area between the arts and the humanities, but I think they're distinct. For one, the humanities are a social approach, not a personal one. So I think projects that are focused on personal expression and creativity fall more into the realms of the arts. Projects where there is a sort of overlap between the arts and the humanities are projects that place art within a social and historical context. So really looking to see how do the arts affect our lives, how they've been historically constructed, what are people's attitudes. That would be more in the lines with the humanities project. And I think the similar consideration applies to sort of non-arts project as well. For example, we sometimes receive requests for projects in the environmental humanities. So if it's really focusing on the science, that would sort of be less what we're in the realm of funding, and sort of more about how do people interact with the environment? What are our sort of social attitudes about science, and how do they reflect the priorities of science? That would be more in the realm of the humanities. So I think, does anyone sort of have any quick questions about the sort of arts and the humanities, the public humanities as a discipline? All right, well, now I'm going to move forward. Let me say a little levity. Oh, the huge manatee. Okay, so common question is, where do you find our grant guidelines? So I'll ask Gigi to put this hyperlink into the chat, but you can find everything you need to know about applying for a grant and more at njhumanities.org/grants. And we definitely recommend that you read everything including the FAQ. The FAQ has a lot of important, sort of great information about the distinction between the arts and the humanities, what makes a competitive project. One of the questions that is really important to our reviewers is the question of audience. So it has some really insightful pieces about sort of how to design for an audience, what is an underserved audience. So a lot of kind of fundamental questions are addressed in the FAQ, but I definitely recommend reading everything. It's kind of go into a lot of detail about the different aspects of our grant program. Here's another sort of fundamental question is which grant should you apply for? So we have two major grant sort of pools, the incubation grants and the action grants. Now the incubation grants are focused on the development or reimagining, so either the development of new programs or the reimagining of old programs. And action grants are focused on implementation and expansion. So it could be an implementation of a new project, even a pilot project, or an expansion of an existing project. I think one thing to really consider is, what stage are you at? And if you really have significant questions about your project, including whether it is viable, then an incubation grant is for you. Now, one of the things that we say about incubation grants is failure is an option. Now, what does that mean? That means maybe you have an idea, but you're not really sure if it really has any legs, if it's a viable idea, whether your audience will respond to it, your intended audiences. So the incubation grant kind of really gives you the space to sort of develop new programs or reimagining programs that have had a long shelf life. So really, I think that's the consideration is if you have a lot of really fundamental questions about what you want to do, then you should consider applying for an incubation grant. However, with an action grant, it's a little bit different. If you have a really clear idea of what you want to do, even if it's kind of in the beginning stages, but you have a clear plan, you've identified, many, if not all of the sort of collaborators that you're working with, all the key components, then you should consider applying for an action grant. That is the most appropriate sort of place. We do consider like incubationists and actionists as part of the criteria for grants. So sometimes that can really affect your competitiveness when applying for a grant, as if you sort of apply in the wrong pool. We try to catch that throughout the process. We do, for example, if you submit an LOI for an incubation grant and we have a discussion, you're like, it kind of comes out as like, actually, this is an action grant, or vice versa. You can switch sort of after you submit your letter of intent. But you cannot apply for both. And one of the primary reasons for that is you cannot have two open grants at one time. So you'll have to apply for one or another. You don't need, I think a common misconception I've encountered too is that you don't need to apply for an incubation grant first to be eligible for an action grant. So really, it really is about not whether you're new to us, but really where in this project are you? Do you have fundamental questions? Or do you have a really clear idea of what you want to do? And that will really kind of determine which sort of pool you should apply for. Now, I think this is a good time. Gigi, do we have any questions in the chat about incubation grants or action grants or sort of any other aspect of our program?
We do not at present, but this is a great reminder to definitely put any questions you have in the chat. Raise your hand if you'd rather talk to us. We'll pause for a moment, see if we have any takers. Oh, I think we have a hand raised. Kerwin Webb, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? Ask your question.
Hi, thank you. So let's say that we apply for an incubation grant and we run that course. Can we then immediately apply for an action one afterwards or vice versa? Is that a possibility?
Yes, we've had many organizations that have sort of developed the program through an incubation grant process and then later applied through an action grant process. The only sort of stipulation is that you can't have concurrent grants. So you couldn't start the incubation grant and then have an open action grant later on. You'd have to sort of finish out the incubation grant, but then you could apply for an action grant afterwards. We've also had some organizations where they've applied for an action grant and then they say, well, this doesn't really work. Maybe we should use the incubation grant process. So it is a fluid process, but we've had many sort of success stories, I'd like to say, of organizations that have been able to use the incubation process to sort of develop and refine their ideas, and then successfully applied through the action grant. So that's a great question.
Thank you.
Welcome. All right, does anybody else have any questions? All right,
we're good so far.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm going to move on. So a little fun visual. I think this is a kind of a way you can kind of visualize the difference between action grants and incubation grants. Okay, so the application process. Now, we have a online grant application system, which incorporates the entire process from the LOI or letter of intent to the final application. And actually, if you're awarded a grant, all the sort of post-award follow-up will be conducted through the system. Now, as Gigi mentioned before, we are 501c3 nonprofit, not a state agency, so we do not use SAGE. We use Foundant. I know people are generally relieved at hearing that. Now, it's fairly intuitive. If you're new, if you haven't applied for any funding opportunities since September 2020, you will need to create an account. There are instructions on our website about how to create an account, or to if you applied in one of the funding opportunities that have opened since September of 2020. If you've forgotten your password, you can reset your password. So that's all available. If you're unsure, I just recommend reaching out to us at grants@njhumanities.org, which is generally the best way to contact us about grants. Questions about your grants, whether it's administrative or kind of more fundamental questions about program design. The first step of the process opens on March 1st. So that's when the applications are not currently available through the portal. However, you can preview the applications. The full applications and the full letter of intent, or LOI, is available on the FAQ page of our website. Okay, so the first step of the process is the letter of intent, or the LOI. Now, I want to say that this is not a competitive process. We are checking for basic eligibility at this stage. And really what that means is your organization eligible to apply? So eligible organizations include 501c3 nonprofit organizations and entities of state and local government. We do on occasion allow organizations that do not fit into that profile to apply with a fiscal sponsor. And actually, I'll say there's one other thing. For the 501c3 organizations, you need at least 1 year of verifiable public operation to apply. So we do verify these details. So that's sort of like one of the basic sort of criteria. As I said, if you do not meet the eligibility requirements, we do allow organizations to apply with fiscal sponsors. So you would need to sort of have a sponsorship from an eligible organization. They would sort of act as the custodians of the funds. So if you have any questions about that, definitely reach out to us. And the other thing we're really looking for is there a humanities project somewhere in there? So if we have questions about that, we'll definitely reach out to you. But as the slide says, nearly all organizations are invited to apply. So this is not a competitive part of the process. People often kind of want to have these in-depth discussions before in submitting an LOI. It's not really necessary. Really, we're collecting some basic organizational information. We're asking a very short description of your project, sort of an elevator pitch, but 1,000 character, including spaces, description of your project. And a brief description of your mission and your organization's audience. So very basic information. However, there are some reasons we do not approve letters of intent. So primary reasons is that organization is not eligible. And we do ask on the LOI if you're planning to apply with a fiscal sponsor, but if you do not indicate that, and you're definitely not eligible, we do not fund if you're like a for-profit organization. One reason, kind of more fundamental reasons we typically don't apply is that it's an art-based project with no discernible humanities content. So we do really kind of look at the difference between arts and humanities. There are projects that are sort of in the gray area that are about the interpretation of art or using the artistic practice to explore humanities themes. But if it's purely about the creation and performance of art, if you're saying we want money to fund a painting, we're not going to approve that. So definitely, and then the other reason is it's projects that are looking for funding for humanitarian or social services related projects. So there's a difference between the humanities and humanitarian. So while humanitarian projects are definitely worthwhile funding, it's sort of outside the scope of what we're eligible to fund by our primary funder, the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, the letter of intent process opens on March 1st and closes on March 15th at 11:59 p.m. Now, I want to stress, the letter of intent is required. This is a required step. And as I said, definitely don't sweat it too much. Try to submit early so that way we can address any problems as they come up. And as I said, if we have any sort of questions, we'll definitely notify you. The other thing I want to say as well is that I'll ask Gigi to put this email in the chat. Sometimes the emails from our grant management system end up in your spam or junk folder. So I definitely would check that. We try to respond quickly. So if there's been, 3 or 4 days and you haven't heard back from us, definitely please reach out to us by email. There's a high likelihood that your notification email just ended up in your spam or junk folder. And the email, Gigi, you have the email, correct? I can put it in the chat if you don't.
Can you remind me real quick? It's administrator at, is that right?
It's administrator@grantinterface.com.
Thank you. Putting it in the chat right now.
Yeah, so definitely if you have the ability to sort of whitelist or mark emails as safe, definitely do it for this one because we'll be sending you notifications if you submit an application. Okay, so moving on. These are the sort of big areas of the application that we're going to cover. Project period, the narrative, the budget, humanities scholar, other materials, and just sort of a reminder, we'll go over the due dates later, but the final application is due by April 15th, 2021 at 11:59 p.m. So any of the due dates that you see across the board, they're due just at the 11:59 p.m. at the very end of the day. Now, Gigi, before I move on, do we have any questions or comments?
How's everybody doing with questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat right now. I'm going to scan for questions. If you raise your hand.
Also, if you feel I'm talking too fast, definitely put that in the chat because I sometimes do that. So,
James, there is a question.
Yes.
Is there a sample letter of intent or is the information required on the letter on your website?
Yes. So if you go to the grants FAQ currently, so once the application is available, you'll be able to see it. It'll be available starting March 1st. But if you're curious of what's there now, we have a PDF version of it available on the grants FAQ portion of our website. So there's LOIs for both incubation and action grants. They're identical. However, the applications are not for the two ones. So you'll definitely want to look at them, either one, depending on which grant you plan to apply for. But the LOIs are identical. But it's very basic, high level information. Shouldn't take you too long to submit it.
Another question that came up, excuse me, is do you need to have a specific humanities scholar for the project confirmed before submitting an LOI or just before the application?
That's a
We're
great
actually going to
question.
go into this in a minute, but
We're
in
gonna,
more
yeah,
detail.
we're gonna go into this in a minute, but you don't need to have that confirmed at the LOI stage. And depending on what grant you apply for, you'll need to have it, but we're going to talk about that in more detail later. So that's a good question to come up. Anything else, Gigi?
One more thing, if you submit for an LOI for an action grant, but you determine that, but we determine, NJCH determines that it would be better as an incubation grant, what happens next?
That's a great question. So you'll be able to just submit. We'll be able to switch. We don't have the ability because they're sort of the way it's designed to like switch it over behind, automatically, but we would just make the LOI available for the other process. And then you could just apply through that. So we do allow you to switch. You basically just have to like copy your LOI, from the one form into the other. And then you can switch the grant pools. It should be pretty easy. And then you don't even need to like rewrite the just basically just do the same LOI as before. And then, yeah, if that comes up, we had definitely throughout the process, at least every grant round, I'd say that we have one or two organizations that switch pools.
And then the
So it's
last,
Yep.
Sorry, the last question that came up, there's a couple of questions about types of humanities projects. I encourage people to go to the website and maybe look at some of the projects that we've funded in the past. But one of the specific questions was about digital humanities projects. And certainly we do fund digital humanities projects of different types, including virtual programs, websites, podcasts. I mean, really, there's many different kinds of digital humanities projects.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. That's a great question though. We're a big tent humanities organization, but we're really looking for public engagement and impact. I think that's probably one of the most important things, as we fund a lot of different types of humanities projects, but we're looking for projects that explore humanities with depth and complexity, but also are designed for a sort of public audience or audiences, and that can take many different shapes. Now, go to the first part. So the project period. This is a really important question. And really, I think one way to think about this, when will you be using NJCH funds for your project? Now, one thing I like to say is that I think one thing I notice a lot of grantees do, applicants do, is that they describe like everything they want to do. And I understand that a lot of times you're thinking about this maybe as a multi-year project, you have 3 or 4 years planned, but really kind of want to focus on what will you be accomplishing with NJCH funds during this sort of time period. So this grant might just be funding 1 year of a multi-year project. So you really need to think about what resources you will need during this year to 18 months. Because one is expenses outside the grant period are not eligible. So really any expenses that you've incurred either prior to or after the grant period, you're not going to be eligible to include that within the grant. Projects must begin within 3 months of award notification. So we'll be announcing our decisions by the end of June. So we'll be making award notifications for this round on June 25th, by June 25th, 2021. And you'll need to start within 3 months. So you can't say, well, we want to start this project, in January of 2022. If that's your intention, then you should just wait until the next round. We don't have those calendar dates available yet, but it's going to follow a very similar schedule as this year. Most likely, it's been pretty consistent year to year, and unless there's some sort of really fundamental radical change, I don't really anticipate it being very much different than the kind of current schedule where we have a round that begins in September and a round that begins in February. March. Now, incubation grants can last up to 1 year, and action grants can last up to 18 months. So that kind of gives you a sense for when you can be using the funds for this project. So really something to think about is what can you accomplish during this time period, and what resources do you need during this time period to accomplish your goals? That will really determine the project period. You don't necessarily need to have a 1-year incubation grant or 18-month action grant, maybe you're say, okay, well, this is what we can accomplish in the next 6 months. Maybe, you know, we feel like we can realistically accomplish the goals of our incubation grant in 6 months. Maybe you do need a year. Same for action grants. You know, you're planning, maybe you're planning for something in 3 months from now, and it's going to be all wrapped up in 3 months. So you don't necessarily need the 18 months, but something to consider. When will you need these financial resources? And I think that's kind of really what the fundamental question is for the project period. So something to think about. Do we have any questions, Gigi?
Doing okay so far. I just want to mention to everyone as well that I'm putting answers to questions into the chat in addition to talking about them. Look, you can look there as well. I just made a list of some examples of humanities-based projects, for example, that came up before.
Okay, great. All right, so the next kind of main part is the narrative. Now, we have different questions for incubation and action grants, but really kind of broadly is who, what, when, where, and why. Who is your audience? When will activities be taking place? I mean, I think these days where is less important because it's kind of an assumption it's all going to be online. But I think the other things too is why? Why are you doing this? You know, why do you want to work with this particular audience? Why do you think this project is the most appropriate way to reach your goals? And also the what will you be doing? And I'd say this might seem kind of funny. We say, don't forget the what, but it's actually pretty common. Don't forget the what. Sometimes people focus a lot on the why. This is why we're doing this. This is why this is important to us. But then they don't really like expand upon what they're going to do. And really we're looking, while we want to fund ideas, we're really looking to fund like actionable plans. So don't really forget to address the what. What are you going to do? And you will need to address COVID if applicable. Applicable. I always have trouble with this word for some reason. So if you're doing a virtual exhibit, a series of virtual programs, it's not really necessary to like address COVID in any detail. If you're planning an in-person event or an in-person exhibit, you should definitely address COVID, even if it's going to be a year from now, because at this point, who knows? So definitely we'll need to address like COVID contingencies for your project plan if it's sort of relevant and sort of necessary to the work that you're doing. Like I said, if you're doing all online programming, not really necessary, but even things of like outreach, you know, etc. So kind of a consideration that you'll need to think about as you're sort of drafting your responses. Okay, now the other important part, budget. I think this is the other thing. I think sometimes people focus a lot of attention on the narrative, but they don't really always, sometimes they kind of ignore the budget, and that's to your detriment. Because ultimately, this is a request for funds. So while we're looking to see that you have a plan, we're also, I think, a good indication that an organization has a clear idea of the work involved is that they have a well-constructed budget. Now, the budget kind of falls into 4 primary categories. We have project personnel. So this would be essential project personnel. This would be the humanities scholar, members of your project team. So whether it's internal or external people. So people who are kind of, I'd say that like people who are fundamentally involved in the implementation, the execution, the planning, development of your project, these are people that are appropriate in project personnel. If you're hiring a photographer for an event, not necessarily like project personnel. Sometimes there's gray area. I mean, there's a little bit gray area between this and supplies and services, but we'll get to that in a moment. Travel and lodging, pretty self-explanatory. I noticed in the last couple of rounds, been very little travel and lodging, but if you need to, if you're doing research and you need to travel to a museum, or you know, you're you have a scholar that needs to travel to a site and you need to pay for the travel expenses, that's where it would go. Supplies and services is a very broad category, but could be many different things. you need to buy a Zoom license for your online programming. Supplies and services. You want to hire a photographer, a graphic designer. Supplies and services. If you are looking to, mail out some promotional materials, could go under supplies and services. And the last is indirect costs, which is really overhead. So expenses that are not directly related to your project, but are sort of necessary for your organization to exist. So you can put a percentage of your grant request within indirect costs. So not things that are sort of say directly related to the project, but are sort of necessary. You still need to keep lights on to have your project run. Now, one really important thing, we have a required minimum one-to-one match between the request and matching funds. So matching funds are really sort of other resources that you contribute towards your project. So this could be cash. So for example, this could be money from your organization's general operating reserves, from other grants. It could be so that's cash. In kind is the value of volunteer goods and services. So if you have volunteers working on your project, if you are having resources donated, for example, you're having room rental donated for an in-person event, that could be under in kind. So we require a sort of one-to-one, 100% match in the aggregate, but you don't need to match each individual line item. So for example, if you request $1,000 for Humanities Scholar, you don't need to necessarily match $1,000 cash, $1,000 in kind for them. You can have all the match in one, all the requests in one category, all the match in another. Depending on your organization, you might have a lot of cash, or you might have all in kind, depending. If you're, a university or, a sort of well-funded institution, you probably have more cash. If you're an all volunteer run organization, you'll probably have majority in kind sort of matching funds. It really kind of depends on your organization, but we're really looking to see that you have 100% match for your request. So if you're requesting $20,000, you need to match it with $20,000 at a minimum. So that's something to consider when you're constructing your budget, in terms of how much resources do you have, how much resources are you getting from the grant, but how much are you constrained by sort of the matching requirements as well. Now, two really sort of important points. Make sure to review the ineligible costs in the grants overview. So if you go to the grants guidelines, the grants overview main page, you'll see a section called budget and fiscal requirements. We have a list of ineligible expenses. Too many to go over in here, but some big ones include sort of, we don't support general operating funds, we don't support lobbying, we don't support alcohol. So those are ineligible costs within the grant, but definitely make sure to review that, because that could really impact your competitiveness of your proposal and perhaps even make you ineligible for funding. So definitely would recommend reviewing that before submitting your final, really before submitting your LOI, but definitely before submitting your final application. Another important consideration is make sure your budget aligns with the narrative. What do I mean by this? I can kind of give an anecdote. We had an organization that requested, they had a grant to fund a series of walking tours. Great, well-written narrative, but almost half the budget was for bus rentals, and there's no mention of buses within that, within the narrative at all. So we're kind of wondering, well, what do they need the buses for? So really, it's looking to see that is the sort of work reflected in the narrative? Also, is the work in the narrative reflected in the budget? And I think honestly a good way to sort of, we'll kind of go over this in more detail in our March 18th workshop, which is called Creating an Outstanding Proposal. We'll kind of go into some of the considerations, some of maybe the sort of more philosophical considerations about the narrative, but also really practically how to think about aligning your narrative with your budget. What exactly do we mean by that in more detail? But I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're writing that is, sometimes I actually recommend to organizations actually write your budget first. So kind of write a really high level overview of the work that you want to do within the time period. Sort of mentioned before, what can you reasonably accomplish within the time period that we allow for the grants? Okay, so start with that, write the budget, and then write the narrative. So I think a lot of people they kind of focus on the narrative a lot because this is a humanities. I think people might be more comfortable with writing than sort of the budgetary aspect, but definitely ignore the budget at your peril. So I think this is a good spot to answer, to open it up for questions if anyone has any.
There's a few that have come up that I've also answered in the chat. To reiterate, matching funds, yes, can be used, volunteer hours can be used as matching funds. They are in kind, so non-cash matching funds. Also a recommendation to please verify the amount of your volunteer hours that you're attributing to volunteer hours. People regularly lowball that number, and we have resources on our website to help you with that, to help you determine the value of volunteer time. Additionally, there was a question about how we pay out grants. So assuming you receive a grant from us, we pay out 90% upfront. So it's within the first about 4 months of the grant, you will receive 90% of funds. We reserve 10% for after the submission of your final report at the end of your grant project. That's how that works. And that's the same for both incubation and action grants.
Yeah, and I think one thing I want to say about that is some people might get confused and say, well, you pay some of it afterwards. How does that work? So we're looking less at like, looking at costs incurred. So it could be sort of like invoice. If you have an invoice for something or you sort of committed the cost, then we'll sort of pay it out afterwards with the grant. So.
Great. There was also a question that came up during this time period about documentary films. We have funded documentary films, both at incubation and action grant stage. Our grants are just small, so that's something to keep in mind.
Yep. Yep, so it could be, incubation grant could be sort of planning the documentary, doing archival research, reaching out to people, seeing what resources are available. And, the action grant could be for filming costs. So kind of a practical example of the difference between an action grant and incubation grant. So I'm going to move forward unless we have any further questions.
James, can you remind me what your next section is? We have one more question, but I think you might be getting to it.
The next section is on the humanities scholar.
Yes, that's right. Let's pause for this question briefly. And I think you're going to get into it a little bit more, but our site states that a competitive project involves the public in the project's conception well before execution. Can we give some examples of that? Is it a hard and fast requirement or a criterion that is looked upon favorably? This is a great question.
Yes, this is a great question. This is something we're not really covering in depth in this, but I think it's an important question to consider is, so the sort of involvement of the public in the project can sort of take place in many ways. A common example could be, maybe you have an advisory committee. So you're an institution, you have professionalized staff, but you're looking to work with a community. You could sort of create an advisory committee of members of that community who sort of help you steer the project, give their input on it. Could be through focus groups. There's sort of many different ways. It is. I would say it's something that is scrutinized by the reviewers, and that like it's gonna if it's not really clear how the public is involved, if it seems like sort of very much more of a personal interest project or a project that's sort of really this kind of comes up in a lot more in university focused projects, but really seems more like sort of an individual scholar's research project. It's not going to be competitive. Really looking for projects that deeply involve the public in its implementation and planning. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, Gigi.
I think the only thing I would add is that when we're talking about that question about involving the public, we're talking a lot about relevance. How do you know that the public is interested in or cares about your topic? And having their direct involvement is one way of showing that, but there may be a number of other ways that you can do that. These are so specific to projects that it's helpful to have a consultation about your particular project, if like to go over the details that might be relevant to your particular project. That is open to everyone. Also, again, I don't want to get too in the weeds about this right now, because this is a lot of what we go over in the creating a competitive proposal workshop, which is, again, March 18th. Mark your calendar, register
Yep.
now.
Absolutely. But
I'll
I
put
think
the registration guideline in there. We had a request for James for each of us to give a favorite rewarded grant project of an action or incubation example. That's a tough one to jump for, at least for me to jump on right away, because there's so many. But maybe we'll think about that for a little bit in the back of our heads and try to answer that before the end of our program. I do want to get through, want to allow James to get through the rest of it. I'm going to put something in the chat as I think about it a little bit more. I love that question. It's a great one.
that's a great question. I think the other thing I want to say too about the audience, I think you said this a little bit, but kind of another way. Sometimes people take the sort of, if we build it, they will come approach, and that's usually not true. And we've seen that. We've seen many clear examples of that not being true. So I definitely think about, making sure that, your goal, how can you align your goals with the sort of audience that you want to reach? Because saying, well, we're just going to do this and they'll be automatically interested is usually not true. All right, so the next part is Humanities Scholar. So this is a common question. This is something we commonly get questions about. I think a good way to think about this is, what areas of expertise does your project need? So really, the Humanities Scholar can serve multiple roles. They can be an advisor, researcher, writer, presenter. They can also even train team members or participants on humanities work. So a Humanities Scholar doesn't necessarily need to be like someone giving a lecture. They can fulfill many different roles. And I think the other thing too is that, and I think sometimes I've seen applicants struggle with this, is they try to find one person to fill many different roles. For example, maybe you're doing a community archiving project and you want someone who is an archivist, but also skilled at doing community outreach. Maybe that person, or another example that came up recently, the organization was looking for someone who was both skilled at data visualization and analysis, but also was a historian of sports culture. Might be really hard to find one person who fills both those roles in the way that you're looking for. So sometimes it makes sense to split it up and say, okay, well, maybe we have this person who's really good at community outreach and engagement, and maybe this person is a really skilled archivist, and maybe this person is really good subject matter expert. So just something keeping in mind. The Humanities Scholar doesn't necessarily need to be like a traditional capital S scholar who has a PhD and is a distinguished professor, at a university. They can be, we often do work with, people who are, academics, in the academy, who work at universities as researchers or teaching as professors, but also we work with, Humanities Scholar could be someone who, has an advanced degree in the humanities, but, works at a museum or a library or some sort of other institution that's not necessarily like an academic institution. Could even be someone who doesn't have formal education, but is considered a sort of bearer of knowledge by the community. This often comes up when working with, Indigenous communities where they're, someone is considered like an expert, has a lot of authority on the culture, but might not necessarily have a formal education. So I think there's definitely different ways you can think about the role, but it's really, what expertise do we need to make this project a sort of deep, rich, and nuanced exploration of the humanities? Someone that can really contextualize the work of the project, ensure that complex ideas are not oversimplified, and sort of kind of really looks to sort of seeking out, amplifying multiple perspectives, and really kind of pushing the team to create rich and nuanced humanities work. So that's where we're looking for, is projects that really have a degree of depth and complexity to them. Now, I kind of lost my train of thought a little bit. This is I had something else to say. Hopefully it'll come back to me about that. What I wanted to say is that this person can be internal and or external. So I think another thing to think about is what areas of expertise can you fill in-house, and where might you need to bring in someone from the outside to sort of help your organization conduct this humanities-based work. So maybe you have everyone you need internally. That sometimes is the case, but maybe you need to bring someone in from the outside. Sometimes if you're having struggling with a program, maybe bringing in someone from the outside is actually a good thing. You can get a sort of outside perspective on it. Now, in terms of a requirement, this is absolutely a requirement for an action grant. Like if you do not have a humanities scholar for an action grant, not going to be a competitive project. However, an incubation grant process can be used to identify a humanities scholar. And the questions are worded a little bit differently in the two applications. If you do not have a humanities scholar identified in the incubation grant, really what we're looking for is, can you articulate the sort of skills and expertise that you're looking to bring in, and kind of identifying the process that you would use to identify this person. So that's kind of how you would address it if you don't have that person identified within the incubation grant process. Is really, can you kind of clearly identify what you're looking for and how you will identify them? And the other thing too is, we can help you find a humanities scholar. If you're kind of like, well, we're not really sure who to go to, we've worked with many organizations over the years to help them identify them. We have our sort of networks of people that we've worked with on past programs and projects. So, we do our best to point you in the right direction. Say we can give you their contact information. You would still be responsible for sort of reaching out to them and sort of confirming their interest and their availability, but we can kind of provide you contact information to get you started in that process. So Gigi, I'm going to open it up for questions. I think, actually, you know what? We're kind of running a little bit. Maybe I'll wait till the end because
we have no questions that have not been answered as of right now.
Okay,
I did
great.
give an example of a successful incubation and action grant in the chat if you'd like to read about it.
Great. We're kind of running a little low on time, so I don't want to keep people too much later. We'll definitely stay on a little bit after 12, but in the interest of time, kind of want to move forward. So one thing to think about: humanities, science. I think this is kind of a kind of cheeky way to think about the role that the humanities can bring to your project. Okay, so not going to spend a lot of detail on this, but these are some of the other materials that we'll request. We're looking for your most recently audited financial statements and or Form 990. So if you have both, that's excellent. If you only have one, for example, you might not have an audit because you're too small, please just submit the Form 990. And we say most recently audited financial statements, we just mean the most recently complete audited. So sometimes this comes up, say, hey, we haven't finished our audit from 2020. Can we send the 19? Yes. Whatever's the most recently complete audited financial statements, that's what we're looking for. So if it's 2019, that's fine. Whatever the most recent year is. Proof of eligibility. So if you're a nonprofit, this is your 501c3 determination letter that you'll receive from the IRS. For institutions of state and local government, this can just sort of be sort of a letter to the effect that this is a state, this is an entity of state government, this is an entity of local government. If you have any specific questions, we can kind of cover that during the consultation or through email. If you have it, if you have a humanities scholar sort of involved, we're looking for a letter of commitment from the humanities scholar. So just expressing their interest in the project and sort of outlining what they're going to do. Looking for the humanities scholar bio, CV, or resume. Again, if you have them identified, and I said this is a requirement for an action grant, you'll need this. And then there's optional supplemental materials. So I would say there's space for a couple of supplemental materials. I would say don't really concentrate on this, really concentrate on the budget and narrative. But if there's other sort of pieces of information that you think would be helpful for the reviewers, if you submit a 100-page report, I can't guarantee that we'll read it also. So try to keep it brief and sort of very relevant to the project. So things that aren't really relevant, like if you have flyers from past projects, like a flyer from a past event, that's not really relevant. If you have a sort of, if you're looking to do a museum exhibit, fund it, and you have the museum exhibit plans, that's useful. Could be a report, some nature. So, you know, you have space for it, but it's not really the primary focus of the application. And so sort of the last main thing I want to cover and kind of go for after this will be sort of important dates, and then sort of I'll put my contact information and we'll open it up for a Q&A. So the grant consultation gives you the opportunity to get one-to-one feedback on your project and ask questions about the process, whether it's the application, the guidelines, you know, sort of more fundamental questions about program design. This is an optional sort of piece. We don't require that you do the grant consultation. However, it can be very useful. And I will say that it has saved some projects in the past. So definitely recommend it. You'll receive, when you, if we approve your LOI, you will receive instructions in the approval email about how to sign up for the grant consultation. We have limited availability, so definitely recommend signing up early. We've had such a huge increase in grant sort of interest in our grants program, so definitely recommend signing up. You know, to be a sort of signing up early. And one major difference, if you've applied in the past rounds, we're not doing draft review separately from the grant consultation. So you'll receive one 30-minute consultation. If you want to do draft review during that, that can be an option. We just request that you submit drafts within just 48 hours in advance of the consultation. We'll provide sort of feedback during the video conference. They'll be on Zoom. So I think a good question to think about is, when will our guidance be the most helpful? If you're experienced and you just want a little bit of feedback on your grant, on your draft application, that can be a good space for the grant consultation. If you have a lot of really fundamental questions about your proposal that you need addressed before you can even begin writing your draft, maybe you should do it before, you know, sort of writing the full application. So as I said, this is not separate as it was in previous years, just because we received more letters of intent in the last round than we received for the total amount of applications in all of 2020. So just due to the kind of the interest, and we don't really have the capacity to do separate draft review and consultations separately. So it's all sort of bundled together. Important dates. Remember, letter of intent period opens on March 1st. Closes at March 15th at 11:59 p.m. This is required. If you do not submit your LOI in time, you will not be able to submit a final application. Final application deadline, April 15th, 2021, 11:59 p.m. Now, we typically do not, if you're just late, we will not accept it. If you have extenuating circumstances, just reach out to us in advance. We understand that this is a difficult time for everyone. I mean, even under the best of circumstances, you have challenges, but during the pandemic, I know that a lot of people, so if you have sort of circumstances with it outside of your control, that we can sort of address that, but we typically don't accept late applications of just like, oh, I forgot, I was late. Not an excuse. You have to kind of reach out to us in advance and say, hey, this has come up. We can work with you and kind of see where you're at. We mentioned this before. We have a workshop upcoming on March 18th at 1:30 p.m. It's a little bit longer than this one. It's going to be writing and creating an outstanding proposal. We're kind of going to go into some of the more nuts and bolts of the narrative, some sort of philosophical questions that you'll need to address, and then also some really kind of practical matters of how to align your budget and your narrative and sort of right sizing your budget as well. I think one thing to keep in mind is just think about how much can you realistically spend within the project period that we have, with keeping in fact in mind that you'll need to match the funds by at least 100%. And We'll be making a notification of awards by June 25th, 2021. So we'll be notifying you by then, whether you've been awarded or declined. So we'll be doing both, and notifications will be sent by email. Now, here's my contact information. As I said at the beginning, I'm the sort of lead person on the grants, so I'm the best person to contact. The best email is grants@njhumanities.org. My direct phone number is 609-695-4303. I'd ask that if I don't answer, please leave a message. I've had people who've called me multiple times, not left a message. I might not call you back because I get a lot of junk calls as well. So if you want to, if I don't answer, please leave a message and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Though I would say generally in the pandemic, email is the best way to get a hold of me, the most reliable, and definitely recommend going to njhumanities.org/grants for all of your grant needs. Now, with that, I'm going to stop sharing and let's see, do we have any questions?
James, something that came up in the chat was percentage of grants that we fund. As James mentioned, our application, the numbers of applications have just skyrocketed. And the current answer in our last grant round was we were able to fund about 25%. It was slightly lower in action and slightly higher in incubation, but about 25%. This is much lower. This is a much lower percentage than we have in previous years, when usually action grants we were able to fund around 40% and incubation grants around 50%. It is a very competitive process. We give out about $400,000 in grant awards we anticipate giving out $400,000 in project grants this year. And that's the need far exceeds that. That's why one of our goals is to help you create the most competitive grant possible, because I can assure you there are many wonderful proposals that we simply don't have funding for.
Yep.
We're working on it. Another question that just came up, James, that I'll toss over to you is, can the humanities scholar be compensated through grant funding?
Yes, absolutely, and we encourage it. Please.
So can your staff, to be clear.
So can you.
Internal costs can be compensated through grant funding as well.
I would just say review the ineligible costs. If it's not on there, we can fund it. If you have any questions, definitely let us know, but definitely you can pay for personnel. In fact, we encourage it, particularly for some grants like an incubation grant. It's primarily going to be personnel costs. You're not going to have a lot of other expenses. So you can definitely use the fund to compensate your staff, compensate your scholars, compensate other people that are working on the project.
One thing to keep in mind, if you do receive a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, this has come up occasionally, our funds cannot be matched with NEH funds because our funds are also NEH funds. If you are concerned about this, make sure to bring it up with us so we can just, confirm. It's not federal money generally, it is specific to NJCH. Another question that just came up, also very important, is it NJCH staff that decides who receives grants, or are they reviewed by outside committee? That's
a great question. Neither Gigi, myself, or any other staff members make funding decisions on grants. We have a grants review committee. It's made up of members of our board of trustees, and we also have external evaluators who work in the humanities sector at libraries, museums, other nonprofit organizations. They make the decisions on grants. They're
peer reviewed.
They're peer reviewed. We go through a whole process, review process of, they review them individually, then we meet as a group and discuss them.
It enables us to advocate for you, which is a great place to be in.
Mm-hmm.
I should mention we're just after 12 o'clock, so we completely understand if you gotta go. However, if you have additional questions, I'm gonna stay here for another few minutes. I think James can as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to stay here for, at least another 5 to 10 minutes. So if you have any questions, definitely stay on and we can answer them for you.
great to see so many of you. Thank you for your questions. If there's anything that I forgot about, please put the question back in the chat. Apologies if I skipped it. It was unintentional. And we look forward to reading all of your applications as they come down the pike in the near future or more distant one if you end up applying in the fall or next spring as well. Enjoy your meeting. We mentioned, there's a question here that's coming up. You mentioned that the incubation funding can be used to fund a guest humanities scholar. That is correct.
Yes.
Bringing in outside people for any purpose, whether it's for incubation or an action grant, is a great way to use your funding. Certainly, happy.
You're welcome. Gigi, is there, since people are being a little shy, is there anything that I didn't cover that you think would be useful?
Oh, so much, James. I mean,
Oh.
You barely even scratched the surface. No, I'm just kidding.
That's
You did
true.
great. I mean, there's a lot that we're going to talk about in our next project. Oh yes, a range for grants.
That's a great
good
question.
question. Yeah, why don't you go over the money?
Yes. So incubation grants, we say between 2 and 15. So the cap on incubation grants is $15,000, but the low is $2,000. So we're not going to really fund anything that's less than a $2,000 request, because honestly, it's just probably not really worth your effort. And I think if you're thinking that you're going to apply for a $1,500 grant, you're probably sort of underestimating the amount of resources that you need. So I mean, this kind of comes up a lot too. And this is kind of, and then for action grants, the range is $2,000 to $20,000. And this kind of gets into another question I often ask, people ask me is that, well, will our grant be more competitive if we request less money? And the answer is no. You should really think about what do we need to, what resources do we need within this time period to accomplish the work realistically? So maybe you have a $20,000 grant, but maybe you have a $2,000 grant. So really requesting the full amount or a low ball is not really to your benefit. We're going to be we'll be reviewing your budgets and see if they make sense, because it comes up on either way. Say, hey, does it really make sense for this organization to request this much money? Or sometimes it's like, I don't think they really understand the work involved as well. That can also come up when organizations kind of lowball themselves, thinking they'll be more competitive, but really it kind of sabotages them because it makes it kind of clear that they don't really understand what the work that is necessary to accomplish their objectives. So definitely recommend, this is where it comes in, really thinking about like, what do we need? What resources do we realistically need to accomplish this work within the time period allowed for us? So it's a great question. Definitely something to think about as you're sort of constructing your proposal, is like what will be necessary.
Absolutely. The other thing I would add is our average grant, I think, is about $14,000. It's a little over $14,000.
Yeah.
And that gives you an indicator that we're funding both on the lower, like the lower half and the higher half. So we have grants that hit the whole milieu. We don't get as many requests for grants of $2,000. $5,000 tends to be where things bottom out.
Mm-hmm.
It's rare that we get one that low. But not every grant is for $20,000 or $15,000 in the case of an incubation grant. The other thing to take into consideration is your organization's size and your history. If you're a $3 million organization, we would expect you to have had a grant in the vicinity of $20,000 in the past. We would expect you to know how to and have the capacity to run to manage a grant of that size. If you're an all-volunteer organization that has had an annual budget of maybe $5,000 or $10,000 in the past 10 years and you're applying for 20, it's not a definite no, not at all. But we would certainly have questions about whether your organization was ready to take on a budget that was, 4 times the size of your annual budget. So we can always talk through some of these questions with you in your individually, and certainly, getting familiar with the New Jersey Council for the Humanities and how our grants work with a smaller project and then building over time is often a great strategy. At the same token, we do recognize that one good grant can be transformational for a small project. So
that's a great point.
Consideration.
Yeah, that's a great point to put up. I think too is like it also goes into the realm of like what's the scope of work? What's a good scope of work for you? I think generally depth is better than breadth. So, you know, that's also the consideration as well. Sometimes they say, well, we're so excited, we want to do all these things. And they sometimes it can kind of result in a pretty incoherent proposal where they probably would have been better off just saying, well, we want to do this one thing well. This is our first grant. You know, like I said, if it's an organization with $3 million budget and with lots of years of experience running complex projects, that's less of a concern. But if you're a new organization looking to do this really complex project with multiple deliverables, maybe just think about what can we realistically accomplish given our experience, our resources, the time allowed. Maybe that, you know, doing a complicated exhibit and 10 lecture series and some other in a book in a year is not really realistic. Maybe just say, what one thing could we do really well? You're going to be more competitive generally in that case, because then you can kind of really focus more on that particular aspect of it. That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a hard
Yeah,
question.
it's tough. It's all contextual. It's the humanities, but say generally though that, you know, just think about your experience running these kinds of programs, public humanities programming in general.
We're down to the last little group here. It's so nice to see your lovely faces, by the way. So if anybody has any last questions, I think we'll wrap up in the next, like, I don't know, 2 minutes or so.
Sounds
You
good.
have to go. Lovely to see you. And we do encourage you to, bye Rita, Ria, excuse me. Ria, is that correct? Or is it Raya?
That's Ria. Thank you so much. This was really very helpful.
Good, good.
Great.
Well, definitely get in touch with us if you have additional questions. We're happy to talk anytime.
We'll do that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Gigi. Thank you, James.
Great. Enjoy. It was great to talk with you all today. James, we'll connect this afternoon.
Sounds good.
All right. I hope everybody has a lovely day. Oh, hey, Karin.
Karin?
Your face is back.
Thank you guys for everything.
No problem.
That was great.
All right, I'm heading out, everybody.
Okay.
Gotta
Excellent.
have some lunch, I think. Yeah.
Perfect.
Bye.
I should probably stop recording.
Yeah, maybe.